Anyway, so for those of you who are just kind of flowing in, I'm speaking to Kane. Your channel's called Kane B, and I'll put the link to that in the description. And I came across your channel because I'm in my free time studying philosophy. It's something that interests me. And you've got a really good channel with a load of videos where you basically clearly walk through various topics, various arguments, and you're not particularly partisan. You're just kind of teaching the subject terrain and stuff. So I thought it'd be interesting to have you on to talk about what you're doing and then get your opinion on a few things. So what got you started in kind of doing what you're doing with your channel and YouTube?
Oh, I think it began because I found it useful for learning the topics myself to try to teach them to others. In fact, that's a piece of advice that I think I heard it from John Searle. Like, not personally, I just heard him say it on an interview one time when he said, if you want to, the only way that you really understand something is when you can teach it to others. And I think that's just a general piece of advice that's like out there in the ether. And so that's what I did. I wanted to understand philosophy, and so I thought, right, I'm going to start. I started actually just writing stuff for myself, where it was like, I'm just going to write it as if I'm teaching it to other people. And
kind
then
of like was that like the Feynman technique sort of thing of like where you write almost like a question or a topic at the top, and then you try and go
yeah, that kind of thing. Basically, I just thought, right, I'll write these introductions, I'll write these answers to questions, and then I thought I could just upload these somewhere, put them on YouTube. So that's how it started, as far as I recall. And as you say, that's what most of the videos that I do are like that. Most of them are just intended to be introductory videos. I guess they would be aimed at the sort of educated layperson, as it were. But I try to go into a fair amount of detail. Like it's not. Yeah, I try to look at all the different parts of the argument and stuff. So they're not all like that, but that's the backbone of the channel.
Yeah. How long does it take you when you put together those videos? Because like you are often stepping through quite a few arguments to some depth. Like I went through all of your philosophy of mind series, and I thought like like you were really going like back in depth on like inverted qualia arguments and things like that. And whereas I was like, if I'd done this myself, I probably would have like stopped at a certain point, and you just like kept going. So does it take you a really, do you just spend a long time putting all that information in, or how do you go about that process?
Well, yes, it takes a long time. I mean, it depends on the topic. Some topics you just end up, it's surprising. Sometimes you just get a video done and it's very quick, and you write it in a couple of days. But a lot of those videos, there is a very, very long process of, because you don't, it's not just like writing the video, you got to read the articles, and you got to figure out how, like, where to put the different parts, and it can take a long time. And then there's the, like, just writing the slides and recording it, and it can be a bit frustrating. But yeah, I don't know exactly what the process is in terms of knowing how much to put in. I guess because there's always more you can say, right? So with every argument, there's always somewhere else you might take it. There are always other directions you can go, and so I don't know. I just do it based on what seems intuitively like, okay, this is in depth, but it's not boring. To me personally, maybe other people would have different judgments about that. There is always a danger with philosophy that you're just going to start like really splitting hairs and getting pedantic. And there are some philosophy debates where it's like, okay, does this really matter? So I try to avoid going that far, but I don't know. It's difficult to say. I'm not actually, just in general, when it comes to any kind of work that I do, I don't tend to be very, I'm not sure what the word would be, reflective about it, in the sense that I don't sort of step back and ask myself broad questions about how it should be structured. I tend to just start writing, and then stuff happens.
See what happens.
And I don't understand the process myself. It's awkward because sometimes people ask me for advice, and like I know that I'm quite good at this. It's just one of my skills. There are plenty of things I'm not good at, but one of the things I do happen to be good at is writing essays, writing videos. And people ask me for advice about it, and I don't know what to tell them because I don't know how I do it. It just happens.
Yeah, maybe just get started or something.
Yeah.
So what's your overall relationship to philosophy then? Is it something that you studied as a degree before you kind of got into YouTube, deciding you wanted to teach yourself this? Or is it something you studied in your spare time, then did postgraduate? Or what's your association to it?
Mm-hmm. So I had an interest in philosophy from the age of maybe about 16. I mean, obviously before then I'd probably thought about some philosophical problems. I remember when I was a kid actually thinking to myself, do other people see green the way I see red? You know, to come back to the inverted qualia. And so I'd obviously thought about those things, but not in any kind of rigorous way. But I think it was probably about 16 when I actually started trying to search serious philosophy for myself. Unfortunately, they didn't offer a philosophy course at my school, like at A-level or anything. Right. So it had to wait until university. But then when I was 18, I got really serious anxiety problems. I started getting panic attacks, and I was having panic attacks like every day. And I mean, I say a panic attack. If anybody viewing this hasn't had a panic attack, they probably don't sort of, you know, it's difficult to communicate how crippling it can be. You know, it's an extremely overwhelming physiological response, and it really screwed up my life for quite some time. I wasn't able to go straight to university, and it was around that time when I started the channel. So I actually was doing it before I started the degree. And I mean, this is one reason why I like wanted to learn this stuff, but because I had this you know, this problem, I couldn't do it in the normal way. That I think was, so yeah, it was around that time. That was one of the motivations. And then obviously I got better. I did a degree, did a master's. I'm now doing a PhD. I'm in the third and final year of my PhD.
What are you doing your PhD on?
Well, I mean, all my main interest is philosophy of science, and within philosophy of science, I'm particularly interested in the scientific realism debate, which is basically so scientific realism is, I guess, the common sense sort of view of what science does. A scientific realist will say that science provides us with true descriptions of the world. The entities and processes that are described in our scientific theories really exist. At least our best theories. Obviously, there are plenty of scientific theories that we know are false, but our best theories, the ones that are really well confirmed, they're just true. On the other hand, an anti-realist will deny this and will have a different interpretation of what science is doing. An anti-realist might say that the function of science is to provide theories that allow us to predict and control what we observe. So, you know, we shouldn't believe that like electrons and black holes and so on really exist. They're just useful fictions that allow us to kind of predict and control our observations. So that debate has always been the thing that really fascinates me, and that's basically what I'm doing my PhD on. It's what I did my master's dissertation on. It's what I did my dissertation in my BA on. So I've been within this debate for a very long time. And well, like I say, in the final year of the PhD now. So who knows what will happen after that.
And are you sort of falling down on a particular side in that discussion, or are you bringing what's your new kind of contribution to knowledge if you're able to talk about it at all?
Okay, well, there's my actual position, and then there's the position I'm talking about. So my actual position is I'm very strongly on the anti-realist side. More specifically, I'm a very hardcore kind of empiricist, and I guess we can talk about what I mean by that later. But basically, just to give the answer to your question, my view is that scientific theories are basically instruments. They're instruments for allowing us to act in the world and predict observations and to control things and to manipulate things. I don't think that we are justified in treating them as true descriptions. For me, the main thing is that the central argument in favour of realism is going to involve a kind of inference from success to truth. So if you ask yourself, all right, why do I believe that electrons exist, but the Homeric gods don't exist? Well, it looks like the answer is going to have something to do with the fact that our theories which postulate electrons are so successful in so many ways, right? They allow us to successfully predict, successfully make predictions. They allow us to successfully build instruments, right? Like we can build electron microscopes. So we apply the theory in all of these different contexts and it's successful. And that success is what I think is key to the realist argument, is the move from, we can infer from the success of a theory to the truth of the theory. And it's that step that I reject. I don't think you can make that step from success to truth. So that's why I land on the anti-realist side. So that tells you maybe a little bit about my own position. What I'm actually talking about in my PhD, though, is a view called perspectivism. When you do a PhD, you kind of have to choose a topic that is new and exciting, right? I mean, so yeah, yes, you can put your own views in there, but you can't necessarily just pursue exactly what you believe and exactly the things you're interested in. Like you have to find something new. I mean, certainly if you want to get funding for your PhD, which I did, you have to make it appealing to funding councils, and so you've got to be a bit selective about what you choose to study.
Panpsychism, here I come.
Right. Well, panpsychism. This is a good example, right? You may well think that panpsychism is a completely ridiculous view, or you may be an identity theorist or a dualist or whatever. But hey, maybe it's a good idea to try to defend panpsychism. So what I'm doing in my PhD is I'm trying to defend a view called perspectivism, just because perspectivism is a very recent addition to the realist debate. And I suppose the intuitive way to state perspectivism is what it tries to say is, okay, scientific knowledge is kind of situated in the sense that it's dependent on particular like cultural and historical background, but we can still have justified beliefs about the way the world really works, right? So it tries to say that you get scientific knowledge from like an interaction between humans and the world, right? And so you have perspectival knowledge. So it's a kind of realism, but it's a more limited sort of realism.
Yeah,
where
limited to that perspective or that frame.
Yeah, it's kind of difficult to. I mean, there are lots of questions about whether this is really coherent as a position, because obviously, if you say, well, we can only know the world from this perspective, that maybe looks like you're just going to be committed maybe to a radical form of relativism, like. Because if somebody else has got a different perspective, and do they know different facts, or do they know the same facts, but they know the same facts in a different way? So it's a new position. It hasn't really been worked out yet, and I'm trying to work it out.
That's interesting.
So I don't know. That maybe wasn't such a good explanation of what it is, but as I say, part of the problem is that it hasn't really been worked out yet. So it's difficult to give a capsule statement. But I guess the key idea is, we get knowledge from an interaction between humans and the world. And so, what you don't get with science is this kind of completely objective view from nowhere, as it were. So maybe that makes sense.
There's I don't know how familiar you are with the kind of atheism / apologetics sort of back and forth, but there's a popular YouTuber called T-Jump who, one of the things that often comes up in his discussions, and he has some really good and creative arguments that, you know, like a lot of natural theology back and forth can be the same kind of rehashed arguments. And he's got a lot of interesting things that he's thought originally. But one of the things he often goes with when he talks to theists is he's kind of saying, well, you know, you can't make any testable predictions with your kind of God hypothesis, whereas I can with my naturalistic hypothesis. And so it's interesting what you're saying, is because you're someone who would be an atheist, but I'm guessing you wouldn't take that same sort of view if you're not taking the realism about science. That seems kind of almost fundamental to the way that someone like that might be arguing. Is that
okay? Well, I mean, there's a few things to say there.
There's a lot.
So first of all, you said that you talked about making testable predictions with a naturalistic hypothesis, and I'm curious what the naturalistic hypothesis in that case is. But because you know, naturalism can mean all sorts of different things. I'm a little bit skeptical that you're going to make testable predictions from like naturalism as a whole. But so the other thing is obviously science makes plenty of testable predictions, but I'm not going to infer that a theory that makes testable predictions is thereby true. So, for example, the Big Bang model, right? Big Bang model is a fantastically powerful scientific model. You know, we can apply it to predict and explain a whole host of astronomical phenomena. It makes very powerful predictions. I mean, it made surprising, unexpected predictions, right? Like the prediction of the cosmic microwave background radiation. That was kind of unexpected. You know, it wasn't predicted by other theories. It made this prediction, and then that prediction was confirmed. So, yeah, very, very powerful model. But that only tells you something about how the world works, right? Like on a kind of how the underlying like nature of the world is structured, if you assume that it is true. And I'm not going to assume that it's true. I will say, no, this is a very useful instrumental model, but how the universe actually arose is something that is beyond our grasp. Right. So I don't want to say that would be an objection to the position that you attributed to this other YouTuber, because I'm not sure exactly what his claim is. I mean, certainly if we're talking about like comparing, say, a God hypothesis to a scientific hypothesis, I would say actually my objections to the theist, if the theist is treating God as being analogous to a scientific hypothesis, I think the theist actually makes two major mistakes. So the first mistake is the standard argument that would be given, which is, well, this isn't actually a very good explanation. At least if you evaluate it in scientific terms, it doesn't make particularly good it's not something that makes kind of specific quantifiable predictions. I guess it does make some predictions, right?
But it almost explains everything. You know, like whatever would be the case would just be explained by it, because so you can't say what isn't explained by it, because it explains everything almost.
So this is, I mean, I don't know if it does it explain everything. Like, I feel like there are some things that it maybe rules out. Like if there was a universe where it was just like constant suffering and nothing but like
there might be morally sufficient reasons that you don't know.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. Like, so you can make this hypothesis compatible with anything, but if you're going to take, say, a particular line on how to solve the problem of evil, then you're going to be committed to more specific claims about how the universe is structured, right? But I mean, so look, the point, I can imagine some people thinking that this makes testable predictions, and certainly historically, there have been people who have thought you can get to God just by looking at the empirical evidence, right? So okay, maybe you can propose this as an empirical hypothesis, but it's definitely not a very good one. Like I say, maybe there are some predictions there, but they're not specific quantifiable predictions. It's certainly, it's not making any predictions like predicting the exact value of light bending around the sun that you get with general relativity, right? It's not doing anything like that. And if you accept that explanation, then it introduces a whole load of problems, because you've now got all of the problems associated with, what exactly are the properties of God, and you get you have to work out the answers to those concerns that maybe the concept of omnipotence is incoherent. You've got to answer those kinds of problems. You've got problems arising from the problem of evil. So it's sort of difficult to, fit, as it were, into a coherent view of the world. I'm not saying it's impossible, but certainly you've got, it introduces problems. And if you just look at the God hypothesis over the whole sort of sweep of human history, it's one that has continually reduced its scope of explanatory, its explanatory scope. So you used to be able to apply it to explain things.
The human eye.
Yeah.
But
you can't do that anymore, right? So over time, it seems to be kind of degenerative in the sense that its explanatory scope has narrowed. So for all of those sorts of reasons, it's not a very good hypothesis. But the second mistake that's made by the theist is to think that even if this was the best scientific hypothesis we had, you've then got a whole other, you've got to make a whole other argument before you get to the conclusion that it's true. Because I'm going to say, well, yeah, okay, fine. This is a very instrumentally powerful hypothesis. There's reason to work with it, there's reason to accept it, there's reason to act as if it were true, but we're not justified in thinking that it's true. There have been plenty of very powerful scientific theories that we now think are false. Newtonian mechanics was, for a time, probably if you go back to the 18th century or 19th century, it was the most predictively powerful scientific theory they had on the table. And even today, we still use Newtonian mechanics to do things like send probes to Pluto. So, we still use it, but we don't think that it provides us with a true description of the underlying structure of space-time. The claims that Newtonian mechanics makes about the nature of space and time and gravity and mass and light and the relations that it postulates between them, it's just false. So I would say the same with God.
I was going to, what, with this sort of anti-realist view about science, what do you think are obviously you're describing our descriptions of reality as sort of tools almost in a sense, but what do you think what is reality fundamentally? Why does it follow certain regularities, or why are there kind of mathematical relationships between things like the inverse square law, or so on this view, why does it seem to be is it just that we're so deeply fallible that we can never really say, well, we've worked it out, or what, could you flesh that out for me a little bit?
Well, the answer to the question is basically yes, we don't know. And there might not be a reason, there might not be an explanation, but this is a very reasonable intuition that leads people to realist views, right? Which is, okay, so, how do you explain the predictive success of these theories then, right? Clearly there are regularities in the world, as you said, and that raises a question about what it is exactly that's supporting those regularities. And if we have a scientific theory and it's making really powerful predictions, particularly when you look at theories that say they make novel predictions, right? So some theories are such that we derive a prediction from it, a very surprising prediction from it, before we've actually made the observation, right? So like general relativity, it predicted the value of light bending around the sun. It predicted gravitational redshifting of light. It predicted gravitational waves. It predicts all this stuff that we would otherwise have no reason to expect. That's really deeply counterintuitive. And all of those predictions get confirmed. So that's really striking. It's not like the theory was constructed to fit the observations, because the observations hadn't been made. So yeah, I get the intuition there, and that's the main I think one of the main motivations for realism. But no, my answer is, well, we don't know.
So
that may not be a satisfying answer, but remember, Newtonian mechanics also made a bunch of novel predictions, and that turned out to be false. So, you know, I think that
it's that stopping point. It's how from building the world up outwards. How do you say this is it? This is that final kind of thing. Is that right?
I'm not sure I follow.
So is it like if we think of the corpus of human knowledge as like this little kind of thing that we're building up and chipping away at, it's how we ever say, well, we've got to the edge, like this really is the stopping point of human knowledge here. This is the true description. You'd almost need some kind of infallibility or omniscience or something to be able to say, this is always true everywhere and for all times, or I don't know if that.
Well, I don't know if you necessarily need infallibility. Most people who are scientific realists, at least in the philosophy of science, will be fallibilist about it. I mean, they will say, okay, these theories may not be completely true, and they certainly don't give us the whole truth. That's why there's still more work to be done. But they'll say that they are approximately true. So yeah, I mean, my claim is not a claim about I'm not saying, all right, we haven't got the complete truth. I'm not saying that. I'm saying no, like we literally might just be completely wrong. Which is a slightly more extreme position on that. But again, there have been plenty of theories in the past that were successful but completely wrong. And even in modern science, we routinely appeal to idealizations and simplifications and just like outright falsehoods. So somebody might, for example, model a star as being constituted by an ideal gas, where an ideal gas consists of a bunch of dimensionless molecules that have no intermolecular attraction, and there's just nothing like that. Nothing like that actually exists in the world, at least as far as we know. But by modelling the star that way, we can get really good predictions out of it. So, we know there are cases where we have theories and models which are just false, or which contain things that are straightforward falsehoods that have been successful. And, that's one reason why I will resist the move from success to truth, even for the cases where we don't know that the theories are false, even where the theories haven't yet been superseded.
Someone's comment: fluid mechanics is based on Newtonian mechanics, and we keep using it. And another one, William Paley thought that empirical evidence can get you to God, but most philosophers thought that you needed a priori and metaphysical reasons to get to God. And I was wondering, with your earlier statement about being a radical empiricist, if it was worth sort of delving into that. So first, I suppose, what do you see as the distinction that the person, almost the distinction between the rationalist and the empiricist who wants to, that are there these a priori things, or is it all just sense data that's coming to us, a blank slate? What are your thoughts around that whole discussion, and why do you fall where you fall?
Okay. So yeah, empiricism. I have a very specific way of understanding what empiricism is. Right, okay. And I think that the ways in which empiricism has been defined in the past, or the ways in which it's standardly defined, are not necessarily that helpful. So if you go back to like the early British empiricists, say people like Hume and Locke and so on, then you get this view of empiricism as empiricism is like a commitment to the idea that there are no innate ideas, that concepts derived from sense experience, that kind of thing. I definitely wouldn't be an empiricist in that sense. Indeed, I think that's just one reason not to be an empiricist in that sense is because you do not want a general epistemological framework to end up amounting to a straightforward description of people's psychological capacities or anything like that, because you just open it up to empirical refutation. And some people think that empiricism in that sense has been refuted. When Noam Chomsky, he made some arguments against empiricism. He's talking about that kind of empiricism, and the appeal to things like that people have like innate structures of grammar or whatever in their head. That looks like a fairly straightforward refutation of that kind of empiricism. Yeah. A slightly better way to think about it is to say, okay, we'll say that sense experience is the only source of justification. So people may well have innate ideas, but they just don't provide any justification for people's beliefs or anything along those lines. My own way of thinking about empiricism is that so there's a philosopher called Bas van Frassen who's not really he's not like well known, I guess, he's not well known outside of professional philosophy, but I really like his way of thinking about empiricism. He's also an empiricist, and for him empiricism is what he calls a stance. So a stance is a kind of attitude or commitment. It's analogous to holding maybe a political stance or a moral stance or something like that. We're not making a descriptive claim about what the world is like.
Right.
And so, for example, we're not going to be committed to the claim that we get that, say, knowledge is that beliefs are justified only on the basis of sense data, because sense data involves a particular claim about how human psychology works. It's a claim about how perception works, which may be false. In fact, which probably is false. There are plenty of problems with sense data. So empiricism as a stance, what it involves is, first of all, a commitment to anti-dogmatism. The empiricist is going to be open to any empirical hypothesis, right? Like, we can't just rule out empirical hypotheses a priori, right? Anything might be useful in the construction of science, and so yeah, I mean, this is the anti a priori part of it, right? The anti-dogmatism. Just be open to any empirical hypothesis. The second part of it involves a rejection or resistance, maybe, of demands for explanation, and a dissatisfaction with explanations that proceed by like theoretical postulation. So explanations that involve appealing to a world behind the phenomena, as it were.
Why is that? Could you go into that a little bit? Because is that like a principle of sufficient reason type thing?
Yeah, I mean, it would definitely involve a rejection of that kind of thing. The way that a lot of philosophers proceed is that they think, we have all of these different discourses, let's say, all of these different practices. There's science, there's morality, there's modality. We talk about things being possible, necessary, contingent, and so on. There's religious language. So there's all of these different discourses, and there's a general tendency among many philosophers to say, okay, what we need to do to show that this discourse is acceptable and useful is to search for truth makers, right? To search for facts in the world, right, that will correspond to the parts of the discourse, right? And so you see this with like moral realists, right? A moral realist is going to say, okay, moral values, moral properties, right, that those things exist in the world, and they're what we refer to when we use terms like good and bad and right and wrong. Or if I say that, if I start talking about counterfactuals or necessity or possibility, again, that corresponds to things in the world. An empiricist, part of the empiricist stance is a resistance to that kind of way of proceeding.
Okay.
But the key point, so part of it is a resistance to that. Part of it is going to involve saying, no, we can account for this discourse without making claims about the structure of the world.
Okay.
But key thing to bear in mind here is that empiricism, if you look at it in this kind of way, it's an ongoing project, right? It's not simply a straightforward description of the world. It's an attitude which will mean that we have to look at a whole bunch of different topics, and you can have the empiricist attitude to all of these topics, But I mean, you may not be able to solve all of these problems. If you're committed to the empiricist project, then you want to give an empiricist account of science, of mathematics, of morality, of modality, but you might not be able to do that. And that doesn't really matter because it's an ongoing thing. I think actually you can similarly understand like materialism, naturalism as a stance as well, and similarly as being like projects that are ongoing. Because similarly with materialism or physicalism, if you treat that as a straightforward description of the world, you've got a bit of a problem, because what you wouldn't want to say, I mean, presumably a physicalist wouldn't want to say that the world is exactly what is, say, described by our fundamental sciences, right? Because we know that science is going to change. So, a physicalist wouldn't want to say that. On the other hand, if they say something like, well, all there is in the world is what will be described like at the end of science, why should you believe that there's an end of science? And obviously we have no access to the end of science anyway. So again, if you treat physicalism, materialism as a straightforward description of the world, you've got a similar problem. I think that should similarly be understood as a stance, where that stance would involve something like a commitment to like an attitude of deference to the content of science, and a commitment to like searching for truth makers for parts of our discourse that are scientifically acceptable, or something like that.
Would it be right to say the motivation behind this project is something like so as we don't confuse the map for the territory almost? Because when we have these a priori dogmas in our mind, they can be so far from what's actually out there. Like if we think about something like the ontological argument, for example, where certainly it works within the contents of my own mind, but it doesn't really say anything about reality itself. And is that sort of the motivating factor behind this empiricism, or have I slightly misunderstood some of the things you're saying there?
So I mean, with the ontological argument, I'm not sure what you mean by that, because I don't know in what sense it works within the contents of your mind.
I guess one of the premises I would, whatever is in the understanding exists in the understanding, or something like that.
Right.
And it's I would see it as a sort of a confusion of our representation of reality mentally and internally, for what we can actually say about the terrain itself out there. Like within the within the mind, I might have a maximally perfect being, but it can't bring it into reality that I can conceive of that mentally almost.
Okay, yeah.
Does that?
No, yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, I think that's part of it. So in terms of what like the point is of thinking about empiricism in this way, I mean, part of it is just, well, look, we can look across the history of philosophy and we can find various people who've held all sorts of different views about what the world is like, but who appear to be embodying something like an empiricist spirit. Like Aristotle seemed to embody an empiricist spirit in his objection to Plato's theory of the forms, say. Right, like you can see that sort of debate going on. And then, much later, obviously Hume and Berkeley and Locke had some actually quite different ideas about what the world is like. But in all of them, there's a certain spirit. And so, I mean, it's more just, all right, what do all of these things have in common? And it seems like what's involved in this stance is anti-dogmatism and resistance to explanations that proceed by finding facts in the world, or by attributing particular structures and properties in the world that correspond with successful practices. And in terms of like why somebody would adopt this position, well, it's I mean it's a bit difficult to say, because it's a stance, right? It's not necessarily going to be something that has the same sort of justification as like a straightforward empirical belief. I mean, you're not.
Okay.
It's like you can say, well, okay, what's the evidence for empiricism? And I'm like, well, that's kind of a weird question.
It's an a priori.
Right? given the way that I've just defined it, right? It's a bit odd because what I'm saying is, look, I'm making a commitment to like understand things in a certain way, or I have a certain attitude to things. Like it's a bit weird to ask for evidence of that. I mean, what I can say is, look, you can obviously appeal to arguments, right, that will make this more or less appealing. I've just pointed out that I think there are serious problems with the inference from success to truth, and I think those problems with the inference from success to truth are obvious, or at least they can be made obvious to anybody, no matter what your stance is. If you are a physicalist, say, if you think that we actually do know what the underlying structure of the world is like, or if you're a theist, right? I mean, a theist similarly will claim to know what the underlying structure of the world is like. You'd better have an answer to this argument, right? You better have an answer to the objection that I've raised to this inference from success to truth. And there are plenty of people who've come up with, plausible answers to that. I just happen not to accept them, right? Like ultimately, I think they fail. But I'm quite permissive in the sense that I wouldn't say that empiricism is like the only rational attitude. I think you can rationally adopt different attitudes, and that will lead you to have very different ideas about how we should go about justifying beliefs. It will give you very different ideas about what the world is like and what the function of science is, and all of this. So it's a bit difficult to answer the question, but does that make sense? I'm not sure. I was just thinking
that there's a couple of questions that I want to ask you, and then we can go into some questions from the live chat that I've been getting throughout as well. If that sounds okay for time, I think that would take us another 15-20 minutes or so. If that.
I mean, it's fine. I've got more than enough time today. I'm not doing anything later. Great. So
because I wasn't sure if one, as we were coming up to the hour, if that was going to be a cut-off point or anything.
Oh, no. I mean, I don't know how long these sorts of things usually last, but
it's usually. I mean, the other day I ended up doing a 7-hour stream, but that was.
I mean, 7 hours would probably be a bit much.
Definitely too much.
Yeah.
I've started doing an open conversation thing where people come in, and then that just got a little bit out of hand for a while with various people coming in. But yeah, these interviews are generally around the hour mark, give or take depending on questions and things.
Okay, well, it's up to you.
Okay, we'll keep going for a bit longer then and just see where the conversation goes. So something I wanted to ask you about as well is, a lot of these conversations I have are with apologists or atheists as well, and I actually find myself pushing back against both groups in a lot of senses. But you yourself, from what I understand, would describe yourself as an atheist. And there's a lot of discussion about what do terms like atheism or agnosticism mean. Is atheism simply a lack of a belief in God, or is the adoption of that, is that a rhetorical device to shift the burden of proof, or as most theists would view it that way, or is agnosticism saying we can't have knowledge, or that simply I'm withholding my and how do you kind of approach the various categories that people might want to put themselves in?
I don't know if it's necessarily that important how we define terms, because as long as you say how you're defining it, right? I mean, as long as you're explicit about what it means. If somebody wants to say, okay, I'm an atheist, and by atheism I mean I lack a belief in God, and that's it. I don't believe that God does exist. I just lack the belief. I don't know either way, right? So if somebody could say something like that, fine, right? You've been clear about what the term means. I mean, so in general, right, meanings are not things that exist You know, it's not like the word atheist like has this meaning that's just existing out there, and we can get it right or wrong. It's just a matter of convention. I can say that the way that I think it's sensible to understand, the most useful way I think to classify the conceptual space, let's say, is, I would say that atheism is the belief that God does not exist, theism is the belief God does exist, and agnosticism involves suspension of judgment. And that's certainly the way that, as far as I understand, most philosophers of religion use the terms. It's the way that the terms are used by most people, like on the street, like colloquially. If somebody says they're an agnostic, that generally means they don't have an opinion either way about whether or not there's a God. So I'm happy to accept that. There is the main alternative definition, I believe, is the idea that we should think of agnosticism as being about knowledge and atheism, theism as being about belief. So the idea would be something like, you know, an agnostic theist believes in God but doesn't claim to know that there's a God. An agnostic atheist believes there is no God but doesn't claim to know that there is no God, or something along those lines.
Okay.
The problem with that is that, so the way that we generally think of knowledge, at least in philosophy, and again I think this corresponds pretty well to how the term is colloquially used, is that it is literally, so it's pretty much just a matter of having justified true belief. And there are problems with that definition. Gettier problems but you know, like, for most circumstances we can pretty much go with justified true belief. It's justified true belief, or something very much like justified true belief, right? I guess would be the way to put it. And so whatever position you then hold on the God debate, right? If you believe that there's a God, you're presumably going to believe it's true that there's a God, and surely you'd take yourself to have some sort of justification for that. I mean, maybe there are some people who hold these beliefs just without justification at all, but that I think would be very odd. Certainly atheists, right? Like, if an atheist says there is no God, they will generally take themselves to have a justification for that. They will say, well, there is no God because it's logically incoherent, you know, because of the paradox of the stone, or there is no God because of the problem of evil, or something along those lines, right? Like, you're giving a justification. If you take yourself to have a justified true belief that there is no God, then you know there is no God, so you're not an agnostic.
Would you say the lack of belief position, though, doesn't require justification? Is that...
Oh, sure. And so the way, I mean, per my classification, if you just lack a belief, that would be a type of agnosticism. But actually, I think it does require a justification. I mean, you can't just... So the point is that you are confronted with people who are making arguments for one position or another, right? You've got to say something about that. I mean, certainly you can lack a belief because you just don't know the topic, right? I mean, a baby lacks a belief because it just hasn't considered the reasons for and against it. But if you have engaged in any way in these arguments, it just isn't enough to say, well, you know, I lack a belief and therefore I don't have justification. Like, of course you have a justification. The reason why you lack a belief is because you think that none of the arguments given by the theists are successful, and none of the arguments given by the positive atheists are successful. I mean, like, you know, my position. So I've said I'm an anti-realist. Yes, that I would say is a type of agnosticism, because I don't claim that there are no electrons. I just say I don't know. But I have a justification. At least I think I do. Right? I've explained a little bit about why I hold the position I do. So no, people that lack a belief do need to give reasons. They do need to have a justification for that.
Right.